The morning started like any other. The sun was just rising over the lake, turning the water into a sheet of gold that reflected the first soft light. Birds were singing. The gentle breeze rippled across the surface, and the only sounds were the quiet lapping of the water against the dock and the occasional call of a distant loon. He had always loved mornings like this. It was peaceful, a rare moment of calm that felt like it belonged only to him. He stepped out onto the porch with a cup of coffee in his hand, enjoying the warmth and the smell of the fresh air. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that allows a person to think clearly. But today, that quiet was broken by the sight of a thick envelope lying on the welcome mat. It was different from the usual mail, heavier, official-looking, with the letters HOA stamped in bold on the front. He frowned, picking it up. He had lived here for years and had never had much interaction with the Homeowners Association. Most of the time, they seemed like a distant bureaucracy, a background presence that rarely affected his life. He opened the envelope carefully, feeling a mix of curiosity and unease. Inside was a letter typed in formal, cold words that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The letter claimed that he was in violation of new lake usage rules that had been enacted by the HOA. It listed several points about restrictions on docks, boats, and even how close one could fish to the shore. At the end, there was a warning. If he didn't comply immediately, he could face fines, legal action, and further penalties. He read it twice, then a third time, trying to make sense of it. The letter felt like a threat disguised as a notice. He set the letter down and stared at the lake. His lake had been in his family for years before the HOA was even formed. He could remember, as a child, sitting on this same dock, skipping stones, and feeling a sense of freedom that he hadn't felt anywhere else. Now, someone was telling him that all of that could be taken away if he didn't follow rules he had never agreed to. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the rush of anger and confusion. Over the next few days, the tension in the neighborhood grew. He started noticing subtle things that had never been there before. The security patrols of the HOA, which usually only appeared during community events, were now circling near his property more frequently. A few neighbors gave him wary looks, as if they had been told to keep their distance. Even the usually friendly couple across the street barely said hello. It was like an invisible wall had been erected around him. The sense of isolation was almost as suffocating as the threats themselves. He tried to talk to the HOA president over the phone. The conversation was tense but polite at first. The president explained that the rules were new, put in place to ensure the lake was shared fairly among all homeowners. But when he asked why he had never been notified of these changes, the president grew defensive, insisting that it was his responsibility to keep up with the community newsletter and the monthly meetings. The conversation ended with a thinly veiled warning. If he continued to resist, legal action would follow. That call left him feeling frustrated and powerless. But it also sparked something else inside him, a determination to not be bullied. He began to research. Late into the nights, with the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional hoot of an owl, he dug through old property documents, maps, and previous HOA agreements. He wanted to understand exactly what he was dealing with. What he found was confusing at first. There were pages of legal jargon, footnotes, amendments, and fine print. But as he read carefully, he started to see inconsistencies, small details that didn't quite fit with the HOA's claims. The more he looked, the more he realized that the lake had always been part of his property. Somehow, somewhere along the line, the HOA had assumed ownership or control without proper legal authority. Meanwhile, tension in the neighborhood continued to build. One afternoon, as he was fishing by the edge of the lake, a HOA security officer approached him. The officer's tone was polite but firm, reminding him that his activities were now restricted and that further infractions could lead to fines. It was the first time he had felt the weight of their presence so directly. The officer left, but the message lingered like a shadow. It wasn't just a letter anymore. It was real, tangible, and threatening. He knew that this couldn't continue. It wasn't just about the rules or the fines. It was about principle, about standing up for what was rightfully his. Every time he looked at the lake, he remembered the countless hours spent there with family and friends. The peace he had found on that dock, the freedom of waking up to the sun sparkling on the water. He wasn't going to give that up without understanding exactly what he owned, and what the HOA could or could not do. The following week brought more tension. Notices were posted on community bulletin boards, warning residents about unauthorized use of lake property. Some neighbors whispered that he had been difficult and uncooperative. Rumors spread, making him feel more like an outsider in a place that had always been his home. Yet instead of retreating, he began to document everything. Every letter, every interaction, every patrol sighting was noted. He photographed signs, copied documents, and kept careful records. He wanted a clear picture of the situation, a trail of evidence that could support him if things escalated further. He also started reaching out to a few longtime neighbors, quietly asking questions about past lake usage and previous disputes. Some were hesitant to speak, afraid of angering the HOA, but a few were willing to talk. They shared memories of how the lake had been used freely for decades, how the HOA had never enforced such strict rules before, and how certain decisions had been made without community input. These stories confirmed what he suspected. The HOA's claims were recent, forced, and lacked historical precedent. As the days passed, the stress began to take its toll. He found it hard to relax even when he was home alone. The constant feeling of being watched, of being judged, of potentially losing something that was rightfully his, weighed heavily on him. Sleep was restless, and he often woke in the middle of the night thinking about the letter, the patrols, and the looming threats. But amidst the stress, he also felt a spark of resolve. This wasn't just a fight for property. It was a fight for fairness, for truth, and for the right to enjoy a place he had cared about for years. One evening, he sat on the dock as the sun dipped low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the lake. The water glowed with orange and pink hues, the kind of beauty that makes you pause and just breathe. He held his head in his hands, thinking about what the next step should be. It wasn't enough to be angry. He had to be smart. He had to be prepared. And most importantly, he had to understand every detail of his property rights and the history of the lake. He made a plan. He would continue gathering documents and evidence. He would talk to legal experts quietly, without alerting the HOA. He would keep a record of every encounter and every communication. And he would wait for the right moment to make them realize the truth. For now, he had to be patient, calm, and meticulous. This was just the beginning of what promised to be a long and challenging journey that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about the lake. The gentle sound of water lapping against the shore seemed to echo in his mind. It reminded him why he was fighting not for revenge, not for anger, but for the simple, profound right to enjoy his home and his lake in peace. The struggle ahead would be difficult, no doubt, but he felt a quiet determination growing stronger with every passing day. Whatever the HOA thought, whatever they said, he was not going to back down. He knew the truth, and one day, the truth would speak louder than any letter, any patrol, or any threat. The days that followed the arrival of the HOA letter were tense and strange. Every morning, he would step out onto the porch and look at the lake with a mixture of love and frustration. The water was still as beautiful as ever, shimmering under the early sun, but it no longer felt entirely like his own. The sense of ownership and freedom that had always come naturally now seemed fragile, threatened by rules he had never agreed to, and by people who claimed authority he didn't recognize. Neighbors began acting differently. Some avoided him altogether, walking their dogs along different paths or taking detours on their morning jogs. Others, more daring or curious, would glance at him from behind fences, whispering to each other, as if he were a character in some unfolding drama. He knew the HOA had spread their narrative, painting him as uncooperative, and it stung. He wasn't looking for conflict, but he also wasn't going to back down from something that belonged to him. One afternoon, as he walked along the edge of the lake, he noticed a security vehicle parked near the far side of the property. A uniformed officer sat inside watching. At first, he tried to ignore it, focusing on the feel of the soft dirt under his feet and the cool breeze across the water. But the gaze of the officer was unmistakable, a silent reminder that he was being watched. Every step he took felt measured. every movement observed. It was disconcerting and frustrating, but it also hardened his resolve. He wasn't going to let intimidation drive him away. He decided it was time to confront the situation more directly, but not recklessly. He spent hours each night going over the documents he had collected: maps, old property deeds, survey records, and letters from previous owners, all pieces of a puzzle that began to paint a different picture from what the HOA was claiming. Each discovery strengthened his confidence. He realized that the lake had never been truly part of the HOA's jurisdiction. Somehow, over the years, they had assumed a control that they didn't legally have. Understanding this gave him a quiet sense of power. He knew the rules, the laws, and the history favored him. If he could present them correctly, the tension escalated when the HOA sent another letter. This one was more aggressive, warning of fines for continued noncompliance and suggesting legal action could follow immediately. The words were formal and precise, yet underneath there was an unmistakable edge of threat. The letter implied that resistance was futile, that they had authority over him, and that everyone else in the neighborhood expected him to comply. Reading it, he felt the familiar rush of anger and fear. But he also felt something else, a growing determination to fight back, not with shouting or aggression, but with facts and truth. He decided to talk to a few longtime residents quietly. Most were hesitant to say anything, worried about repercussions, but a few, the ones who had lived by the lake for decades, were willing to share stories. They spoke of times when the lake had been used freely, when no one worried about patrols, signs, or rules. They spoke of community picnics, family gatherings, fishing competitions, and quiet evenings on the dock. Listening to them, he felt a deep sense of connection. It's not just to the land, but to the memories and traditions that had always defined it. It reminded him why this fight was important. It wasn't just about ownership. It was about preserving a way of life. It's a sense of freedom and history. The HOA seemed to sense his growing defiance and increased the pressure. Patrols became more frequent. Notices appeared on bulletin boards and community newsletters, warning about unauthorized use of lake property. It was clear that they wanted to isolate him, make him feel small and powerless, and push him into submission. Each notice, each patrol, each whisper from neighbors was like a piece in a chess game, but he refused to be moved like a pawn. Instead, he became more meticulous in documenting everything. Every interaction, every letter, every incident was recorded and saved. He knew that knowledge and preparation were his strongest allies. During this time, he also sought professional advice. Without alerting the HOA, he consulted with legal experts who could interpret the complex property documents. They confirmed his suspicions. The lake was legally tied to his property. The HOA had no claim to control it, no matter what they said. The confirmation was like a light breaking through fog. He felt relief, yes, but also the weight of responsibility. He had the power to defend his property, but he had to do it carefully and correctly. One misstep could give the HOA leverage, so patience and precision became his strategy. Despite the growing tension, he tried to maintain some normalcy in his daily life. He continued his morning walks along the lake, his quiet fishing afternoons, and his evenings on the dock, watching the sunset. These moments were vital. They reminded him why he was fighting and gave him the clarity to think rationally. He couldn't let anger or fear dictate his actions. The lake had been a place of peace for decades, and it needed to remain so. Even in the midst of conflict, then came the confrontation he had been expecting. One afternoon, a small group of HOA officials arrived at his property without notice. They claimed to be there to inspect the lake usage and ensure compliance. He greeted them politely, but inside his mind raced. They had no legal authority to enter his land without permission. He calmly asked them to wait while he reviewed the documents. Their confident expressions faltered when he presented some of the older deeds and surveys he had collected. There was a tense silence, a moment of realization that he might know more about the property than they expected. After the officials left, he felt a mixture of relief and renewed determination. The encounter showed him that the HOA was willing to push boundaries, but it also showed that he had the evidence to protect himself. The experience reinforced the importance of staying calm, documenting everything and understanding the law. He realized that this was not just a personal battle. It was a test of patience, strategy, and resolve. The next few weeks were a careful dance of observation and preparation. He continued to gather information, talk to supportive neighbors, and consult experts discreetly. The lake became a symbol of both the fight and the peace he was trying to preserve. Every morning when he walked along the shore, he felt the weight of responsibility, but also the strength of knowledge and truth. Each gentle ripple on the water reminded him of what was at stake. At night, he would sit by the window, looking out over the lake, reflecting on the unfolding situation. The tension of the days, the whispers of neighbors, the letters from the HOA all were reminders that standing up for what was right was never easy. But he also felt a quiet pride in his approach, measured, thoughtful, and prepared. He wasn't just reacting. He was planning, building a foundation for the day when the truth would be undeniable. He knew the HOA would not give up easily. They had invested time, authority, and social pressure into their claims. But he also knew something they didn't. He had history, law, and meticulous evidence on his side. Each passing day of observation and preparation strengthened his confidence. He understood the importance of patience and timing. The right moment to present the facts would come, and when it did, there would be no room for doubt or denial. Through it all, the lake remained his sanctuary. No matter the letters, patrols, or rumors, he could still walk along the shore, feel the breeze, hear the water, and remember why he had chosen this place as home. It was a reminder that the battle wasn't about anger or revenge. It was about preserving what was rightfully his, in a way that was fair, calm, and undeniable. Each morning, as the sun rose over the water, he felt a quiet determination growing stronger. He was ready for whatever came next, confident that truth and patience would guide him through the conflict with the HOA and keep the lake, and his peace, intact. The following weeks were a mix of careful observation, quiet research, and strategic planning. Each day began with the soft light of dawn reflecting on the lake, a reminder of what was at stake. He spent hours examining property deeds, survey maps, and historical records, piecing together a timeline that stretched back decades. As he read, a clearer picture emerged. The lake had always been linked to his property. The HOA's authority was assumed, not legally granted, and this knowledge gave him both relief and a growing sense of purpose. He kept his activities low-key, walking the shore in the mornings, fishing in the afternoons, and sitting on the dock at sunset to reflect. Yet, in the background, the HOA's presence loomed. Security patrols became more frequent, and notices appeared in newsletters, warning about unauthorized use of the lake. Some neighbors avoided him entirely, while others whispered when they thought he wasn't looking. It was a strange combination of isolation and vigilance, but he refused to let it break his focus. He was determined to be prepared before taking any direct action. One afternoon, he decided to take a closer look at the official maps of the property. With a ruler, a highlighter, and a magnifying glass, he traced the boundaries, comparing them to the HOA's claims. Every line, every notation reinforced what he already suspected. The HOA's maps were sloppy and inconsistent. They failed to reflect the historical reality of the property lines and, more importantly, the legal documents that established ownership of the lake. The evidence was slowly stacking in his favor, and the more he examined it, the more confident he became. He also spoke quietly with long time. Residents who had memories of the lake predating the HOA, their stories were vivid and detailed, full of family gatherings, fishing trips, and late-night conversations under the stars. They spoke of times when no one monitored the water, when the community respected each other's space but never claimed exclusive rights. These accounts, when combined with the documents, painted a clear picture. The HOA's claims were recent, forced, and unsupported by history or law. Each story he heard added weight to his evidence, and he began organizing it into a coherent narrative he could present when the time was right. The pressure from the HOA continued. Notices, letters, and warnings became more aggressive. They claimed that continued resistance could lead to immediate fines and legal action. They had assumed that fear would make him comply, that social pressure and threats would convince him to abandon his rights. But he had no intention of backing down. Instead, he focused on building a stronger case, gathering every document, photograph, and eyewitness account that could support him. Patience and preparation became his strongest allies. As he worked, he reflected on the broader implications of the situation. This was more than just a dispute over property. It was a matter of principle. It was about knowing one's rights, standing up for what was just, and not allowing authority to go unchecked. The lake was more than land and water. It represented freedom, history, and personal connection. Losing it would mean surrendering not just property, but a piece of his life. This understanding deepened his resolve. He was not motivated by anger or revenge, but by the desire to preserve something valuable and irreplaceable. He began organizing the evidence methodically. Photographs of the lake, copies of deeds, historical surveys, and letters from previous owners were arranged in chronological order. He made notes about inconsistencies in the HOA's claims and documented every interaction with them, from letters to patrol visits. This careful preparation gave him a sense of control amidst the chaos. The HOA had power, but he had facts. And facts, when presented clearly, could not be ignored. One evening, a small group of neighbors approached him cautiously. They had heard about the conflict and were curious, perhaps even concerned about the outcome. They asked questions about the lake, the HOA, and the notices. He answered honestly, sharing what he could without revealing all of his strategies. The conversations were reassuring. They reminded him that he was not entirely alone, that there were others who remembered the history of the lake and understood the importance of fairness. Their support, even if quiet, was invaluable. Meanwhile, the HOA continued to test boundaries. Patrols occasionally hovered near his property, and letters became more formal, almost legalistic in tone. They seemed to assume that intimidation would work, that consistent pressure would wear him down. But he remained calm and methodical, using each interaction to gather more evidence and to refine his understanding of the situation. He knew that reacting emotionally could be dangerous. Precision, clarity, and patience were key. Late at night, he often sat by the window, looking out over the lake. The water glowed softly under the moonlight, a gentle reminder of what he was protecting. The silence of those hours allowed him to think clearly, to plan his next moves, and to reflect on the principles at stake. Each ripple of the water seemed to echo a sense of continuity, a reminder that history and truth were on his side. These quiet moments strengthened his resolve, reminding him why the fight was worth it. He also began drafting letters of his own, not to send yet, but to organize his arguments. Each letter laid out points about property rights, historical usage, and the inconsistencies in the HOA's claims. He included references to legal documents and personal accounts from longtime residents. The exercise of writing these letters helped him clarify his thoughts and gave him confidence that, when the time came, he could present his case clearly and convincingly. It wasn't about confrontation for its own sake. It was about ensuring that truth and fairness prevailed. As weeks turned into months, the tension remained, but his preparation never wavered. He learned to anticipate the HOA's moves, to expect letters, patrols, and social pressure, and to respond calmly and methodically. He maintained his daily routines along the lake, allowing himself moments of peace and reflection amidst the conflict. Fishing, walking along the shore, and observing the changing light on the water became his anchors, grounding him and providing clarity. Finally, after months of careful preparation, he began to feel that the moment of confrontation was approaching. The evidence was strong, the historical records were clear, and the stories of longtime residents added context that the HOA could not easily dismiss. He knew that when he presented his case, it would need to be precise, calm, and undeniable. The lake was more than just property. It was a symbol of fairness, history, and personal connection, and he was ready to defend it. As he looked out over the water one last time before nightfall, he felt a mixture of anticipation and resolve. The fight ahead would be challenging, but he was no longer reacting out of fear or frustration. He was acting with knowledge, preparation, and a deep sense of justice. The HOA could continue to apply pressure, but they could not undermine the truth. When the right moment came, he would show them. Not with anger or shouting, but with facts, history, and evidence. Exactly who really owned the lake. The day of the meeting arrived with a tension in the air that was almost tangible. He could feel it as soon as he stepped outside in the morning. The sun was shining, but there was a crispness to the breeze that made him feel alert and aware. The lake, as always, glimmered quietly, but today it seemed to hold the weight of what was about to happen. He had spent months preparing for this moment, and now it was here. The HOA had called a formal meeting at the community center, and it was clear that they expected him to either comply or be publicly pressured into submission. Arriving at the meeting, he noticed the room was filled with residents, most of whom had been there for years. Some looked curious, others wary, and a few even seemed to anticipate a confrontation. The HOA leadership sat at the front, their expressions confident, almost smug. They believed the day would go as planned, that their authority would be accepted without question. But they had not accounted for his preparation, his research, or his quiet determination. He felt calm, focused, and ready. The meeting began with the HOA president outlining the supposed violations. Their presentation was detailed, filled with references to the rules, community newsletters, and claims of noncompliance. They spoke in a tone that suggested inevitability, implying that the outcome was already decided. Some residents nodded along, accepting the information as truth. He listened carefully, taking note of each point and mentally preparing to respond. Patience was key. He knew that facts, not emotion, would win this day. When it was his turn to speak, he stood slowly, feeling the eyes of the room on him. He began calmly, without aggression, thanking the HOA for giving him the opportunity to address the concerns. Then he presented his evidence. Maps, historical surveys, property deeds, and letters from previous owners were laid out in front of everyone. He spoke clearly, explaining how the lake had always been tied to his property and how the HOA's claims lacked legal standing. He referenced specific documents, dates, and past events, guiding the room through a timeline that contradicted the HOA's narrative. As he spoke, he noticed a shift in the room. The confident expressions of the HOA leaders began to waver. Some residents leaned forward, curious now, questioning what they had been told. He continued methodically, showing photographs, recounting stories from longtime neighbors, and explaining the inconsistencies in the HOA's claims. The evidence was undeniable, presented calmly and logically, leaving little room for argument. Each piece reinforced the reality that the lake had always been his, and that the HOA had no legal authority to restrict his access. The president of the HOA attempted to interrupt, trying to assert authority and regain control of the room, but he remained composed, addressing each interruption politely but firmly, redirecting attention back to the evidence. The room, once tense and expectant, now felt a collective pause. Residents exchanged glances, murmuring quietly among themselves. The narrative had changed. Doubt had crept into the minds of those who had once unquestioningly accepted the HOA's authority. He continued, laying out the final pieces of his argument. He highlighted previous instances where the HOA had overstepped, showing how their rules were inconsistent and lacked historical precedent. He emphasized that the fight was not about rebellion or conflict, but about truth, fairness, and respect for property rights. His tone was steady, his words clear, and his presence calm. He did not shout or attack. He simply presented the facts in a way that could not be ignored. As he finished, there was silence in the room. The HOA leaders looked uncomfortable, their confidence shaken. The residents, who had initially come expecting drama, were now processing the information. Questions arose, not from him, but from the community members themselves. How had they not known the history? Why had the HOA assumed authority without proper legal standing? The room was alive with curiosity and reconsideration. The power dynamic had shifted subtly but unmistakably. The president of the HOA attempted a final statement, claiming that rules were still rules and that compliance was expected. but his words rang hollow against the weight of the evidence presented. Residents began speaking up, expressing surprise and support, recounting their own memories of the lake and acknowledging the inconsistencies in the HOA's claims. The room had moved from confrontation to reflection, and the authority the HOA had assumed over the years began to crumble under scrutiny. After a lengthy discussion, it became clear that the HOA could not maintain its position. The evidence was too strong, the historical record too clear, and the community too aware. The president reluctantly conceded, acknowledging the legal and historical facts, though his pride was visibly bruised. The tension in the room dissipated, replaced by a mix of relief and newfound respect. The residents who had doubted him now looked at him differently. Recognizing the careful preparation, patience, and courage it had taken to stand his ground, leaving the meeting, he felt a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. The fight was not over, as bureaucracy often moves slowly, but the immediate threat had been neutralized. The lake was his, the rights established and acknowledged. And the community had witnessed the importance of standing firm when truth and fairness are at stake. The months of preparation, research, and quiet determination had culminated in a moment of undeniable clarity. Returning home, he walked along the dock, taking in the lake as the sun set behind the trees. The water reflected the oranges and pinks of the sky, a mirror of calm after the storm of confrontation. He felt a deep sense of connection and satisfaction. The lake had been defended, not with anger or aggression, but with knowledge, preparation, and patience. Every ripple in the water seemed to echo the quiet strength he had discovered in himself over the past months and the following days. The HOA adjusted its communications, no longer making threats or enforcing restrictions. Some neighbors approached him, offering apologies or simply sharing smiles of understanding. It was clear that respect had shifted, not only from the HOA, but from the community. The battle had been a lesson in patience, preparation, and the quiet power of knowing one's rights and standing by them through it all. He continued his daily walks along the lake, his moments of reflection uninterrupted by patrols or letters. Fishing in the afternoons, observing the sunset in the evenings, and listening to the gentle lapping of the water became his routine again. The lake had regained its peaceful presence, a sanctuary untouched by the previous tension. It was not just land or water. It was a symbol of truth, patience, and justice achieved through careful preparation and calm resolve. Looking back, he realized that the confrontation had been about more than winning a personal battle. It had been about standing for fairness, challenging assumed authority, and preserving a connection to the land and its history. He had learned that preparation and knowledge were far more powerful than aggression, and that calm, steady action could turn a seemingly impossible situation in one's favor. The lake was more than a body of water. It was a testament to perseverance, patience, and the quiet strength of standing up for what was right. After the confrontation with the HOA, life began to return to a sense of normalcy. But it was a new normal, shaped by the months of preparation, tension, and careful strategy. The lake, once a place overshadowed by letters, patrols, and whispers, now regained its quiet beauty. The water reflected the sunlight in the mornings, danced with ripples in the afternoon breeze, and mirrored the fiery oranges and soft purples of the sunset in the evenings. Each day by the lake reminded him why he had fought so hard, not for conflict, but for the preservation of something irreplaceable. Neighbors began to approach him differently. Those who had once whispered or avoided him now walked past with nods or gentle greetings. Some shared stories of their own memories by the lake, recounting family gatherings, fishing trips, and quiet evenings spent in reflection. It was clear that the community's perception had shifted, not only because the HOA had been shown the legal truth, but because people had witnessed the patience, knowledge, and calm determination that he had displayed. Respect, he realized, was earned not through confrontation, but through the quiet strength of standing by one's principles. The HOA, though still present, adjusted its approach. The letters and threats stopped, replaced by more neutral communications, and no further patrols appeared near his property. The bureaucracy had been challenged, and the challenge had been successful. It was a subtle but important victory. The lake was no longer a source of tension or conflict. It was once again a sanctuary. The victory was not only in the recognition of legal rights, but in the restoration of peace. That was worth more than any argument or fine. In the following weeks, he spent more time reflecting on the journey. He thought about the months of careful documentation, the research into historical records, the conversations with longtime neighbors, and the quiet moments of preparation. Each step had been important. The confrontation had been inevitable, but without patience and careful planning, the outcome might have been different. The experience reinforced a valuable lesson. Knowledge, preparation, and calm determination are more powerful than fear, intimidation, or aggression. He also reflected on the broader implications of the fight. This was more than a personal dispute. It was a lesson in standing up for what is right. Authority, when unchecked, can easily overreach. But patience, evidence, and a calm presentation of truth can correct assumptions and restore fairness. The lake had become a symbol of that principle, a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories are won not with force, but with clarity, preparation, and persistence. Life around the lake returned to its quiet rhythm. Mornings were spent walking along the shore, coffee in hand, observing the birds and the gentle movements of the water. Afternoons were spent fishing, reading, or simply sitting in contemplation on the dock. Evenings were reserved for watching the sunset, reflecting on the day, and appreciating the peace that had been restored. Each moment was richer now, formed by the experience and the knowledge that the lake's freedom was secure. The community, too, began to shift. Residents who had once accepted the HOA's authority unquestioningly now seemed more aware of the importance of understanding history, rules, and property rights. Conversations about fairness, history, and respect became more common, and a sense of mutual respect began to grow. It was clear that the struggle had ripple effects beyond just his property. It had reminded the community of the importance of questioning authority and standing for truth. He continued to keep meticulous records, though now they were for reference rather than defense. Photographs, deeds, and notes were organized and stored safely. A personal archive of both the lake and the months-long journey to protect it. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that preparedness and attention to detail had been key in safeguarding what was important. The process had strengthened not only his resolve, but his understanding of the power of knowledge. With time, he began to open up to neighbors again, sharing stories of the lake's history. The traditions that had been passed down and the memories that had shaped life along the water. Some were surprised to hear the depth of connection he had with the land, while others were inspired by the patience and persistence he had shown. It became clear that his approach, calm, respectful, and fact-based, had left a lasting impression, not only on the HOA, but on the community as a whole. As the months passed, the lake regained its place as a center of quiet life. Families returned to picnics, children played along the shore, and the gentle rhythm of nature resumed its unbroken cycle. He continued his routines, walking, fishing, and reflecting. But now there was an added layer of peace. The struggle with the HOA had taught him the value of preparation, the importance of understanding one's rights, and the strength found in calm, deliberate action. It had been a challenging journey, but the outcome was a restored sense of harmony and respect. Evenings on the dock became moments of gratitude. He would sit quietly, watching the water change colors as the sun dipped below the horizon. Feeling the breeze on his face and listening to the soft sounds of nature. The months of tension were behind him, replaced by the knowledge that the lake was safe, not just legally, but as a symbol of his commitment to fairness and truth. Each ripple in the water, each reflection of the sky, was a reminder of the power of patience, preparation, and calm resolve. He realized that the experience had changed him. The months of research, observation, confrontation had strengthened his sense of responsibility and his understanding of fairness. It had shown him that standing up for what is right is not always easy, but it is always worthwhile. The lake was more than a body of water. It was a testament to persistence, knowledge, and the quiet courage to protect what matters most. In the end, the HOA's threats became a distant memory. They had been confronted and addressed. The community had witnessed the importance of clarity, preparation, and calm action. The lake, now fully his in both reality and perception, returned to being a place of peace, reflection, and enjoyment. Life resumed its quiet rhythms, enriched by the lessons learned and the victories earned. The months of struggle had not been wasted. They had reinforced the power of knowledge, the strength of preparation, and the enduring value of standing firm for truth. As he sat on the dock one final time at sunset, he reflected on the journey from tension to resolution. The lake stretched out before him, calm and untroubled, reflecting the sky's colors and the quiet beauty of the evening. He felt a deep sense of accomplishment, not from defeating an opponent, but from upholding fairness, truth, and the principles that mattered most. The lake and the life it represented was secure. The story of standing firm, patiently, with knowledge and resolve had come full circle, leaving him with peace, respect, and a deeper connection to the land he loved.